Hi, my name is Keith Folse, and I'm a professor of TESOL at the University of Central Florida. Today I'm going to talk about one of my latest books, which is Keys to Teaching Grammar to English Language Learners. And I want to tell you why I've written this book, and I think I'll start with a little bit about my background. I have studied many languages for many, many years. I've taught ESL and EFL for almost 40 years now, and I've written lots and lots of materials. One of the things that I think makes me special as a teacher trainer is that I actually have studied many languages and I've taught many languages. I've studied languages in a classroom, and I've studied languages in the streets of Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and Spanish-speaking countries as well. And I've had some success with that along the way. One of the things that's really important in learning a language is grammar. Of course, you've heard me talk many times maybe about vocabulary, and you can't do very much in a language without vocabulary, but the glue that holds the words together is grammar. And so what I want to tell you about is this book, Keys to Teaching Grammar, and why I wrote this book. Well, if you studied a foreign language, as most English speakers have, you studied Spanish or French, you remember in the class and you had all those grammar rules. And if you're teaching now English as a second language or English as a foreign language, you have to know something about the English language. And that would certainly include grammar. So if you're a native speaker of English or native speaker of whatever your language is, you just know how to speak the language, but you don't really know how to teach those rules and those patterns to somebody else. I found myself in the same situation when I was in college. I was going to be a French teacher and clearly studied all those French rules and was ready to teach French, and then ended up in ESL. And I thought, well, gee, I can do ESL. I speak English. How hard could it possibly be? Well, it turns out it's pretty hard unless you know something about your language from the outside. And that's the ESL part. That's the S, the second language part. So I've spoken at many, many conferences, and I've tried to explain to teachers 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 maybe of the different rules or patterns of English grammar. Things like count and non-count nouns. Why do we say many? Why do we say much with certain nouns? Things that a 5-year-old in English gets correct, yet a 50-year-old has no idea of how to explain to somebody else because you've never really thought about the difference between many and much. Well, a few years back I was giving a lecture at a conference in South Carolina, and I talked about, well, I remember that day we were talking about how to pronounce the ED in past tense. All native speakers know, if you can read and write, that you put an ED on many, many verbs, and that gives you want, you put ED, gives you wanted, and well, mathematics, added, subtracted, divided. So why doesn't multiply give you multiply-ed? I mean, why isn't it like that? Why is it multiplied? Why don't we add that extra syllable as we do on the other 3? Turns out there's a rule there. It's not an exception. And this is the funny thing. Almost every native speaker in any language will always say, it's an exception. There just aren't exceptions. The exception is you because you don't know how to explain it very well yet. And that's why you need a book like this or some kind of training to help you figure these things out. I certainly needed this kind of help. And 38 years ago when I started teaching, I really would have loved to have had somebody write all these things down. So that day at the conference, I explained how to do the ED, that some verbs take a full syllable like wanted, needed, added, and there are a few that take a D sound like sneezed or loved or lived, and then there are others that take a T. Why a T of all possibilities, right? So you get coughed and you get asked and you get wished. And so when I finished explaining all of this, and everybody was fine and did the exercise in the workshop, one teacher came up afterward and said, this is really interesting. Is this written down anywhere? And that made me think, well, first it made me think, what a shame it's not written down somewhere. You can find lots of grammar books about English. Don't get me wrong. Google and you'll find many. But the problem with most grammar books is that they assume that you're a grammarian. And the person ends up really talking about grammar for grammar's sake. But my students need something like this. And when I say my students, I'm talking about the teachers in my classes at my university. And I deal with teachers who are K-12 teachers. You're a 4th grade science teacher. You are not going to be an ESL teacher. And I would argue with you. I would support you and say, you're not supposed to be an ESL teacher. You're a 4th grade science teacher. But your students are not going to write EDs on words, or if they do write the ED, they're going to say ed every single time. They're going to say multiply it in the math class. So what do you do? How do you work with that learner? That's one population, K-12. And then I have people who want to teach in the United States in community colleges, and they need training or in intensive English programs where they're in a grammar class, and they have to teach a grammar class. You definitely need to know about grammar. And then I have people who are going overseas, maybe to teach English conversation in Japan or China. And you might say, well, it's just English conversation. You don't need to know about grammar. You're sadly mistaken, as you'll quickly learn on day 1 when you try to teach without knowing something about your own language. So the example I was given in Japan is, Every book has a short activity on cooking something, and it's almost always something like oatmeal cookies. So you have to talk about the recipe for oatmeal cookies. Why do you say how many cups of sugar, but how much sugar do you need for this recipe? Why how many and why how much? Why can't you say how much cups, as every Spanish speaker will clearly say? Well, those kind of things are written down, and they're in this book. So this is the second edition of the book, and I want to talk to you right now about the contents of the book. The book has 5 chapters. One thing I think is really cool, that it wasn't designed to be this way, but it's ended up to be something good. You'll notice if you do the flip test and just look through any of the pages, you'll see there's a white column, which is a gap about maybe 1/4 of the page, and you'll see these gray boxes, right? So if you turn the page, this one has no gray box, and you'll turn a few more pages, and maybe you won't see some, but then suddenly you'll see 2 or 3 others there as well. So that white space, a lot of teachers find that they can, when they do the course with me, they actually keep their notes in the margin there. You know how you know a book is successful? That the used book market doesn't have many copies of this book out there. And that's because people, when they buy this book, they keep this book because they're going to be teaching with it for the next umpteen years. So people take notes there, and those gray boxes actually are notes of sort of the extra things. I'm from Louisiana, it's what we call lagniappe. It's that little extra thing you get, right? So in this case, your lagniappe turns out to be that you have these little gray boxes, which are my thoughts and some of the comments of things that, yeah, this looks pretty easy to teach, but you know what might happen? Those are the caveats, the sort of be careful points that you really need to have along the way. So the textbook is organized into 5 chapters. The layout is what I showed you, that you've got print as you would in any book, as well as the comments on the side, the gray boxes here. So chapter 1 is an introduction to grammar. Chapter 1 just talks about what ESL grammar is, because the average native speaker has no clue what ESL grammar is. Your 8 parts of speech, don't say he don't say ain't, that's traditional kinds of grammar. That's not ESL grammar. ESL grammar is things like, how do you pronounce that ED, as I talked about, count and non-count nouns. If you can say I want to go and I need to go, why can't you say I should to go and I will to go? Modals. Again, this is terminology that the average native speaker has never ever heard of, and with good reason, because you're a native speaker and you don't know ESL grammar. Chapter 1 is an overview as to why you would teach ESL grammar, whether you're a K-12 teacher, whether you're in an intensive English program, or whether you're overseas in a conversation class. Chapter 2 is going to help all of you who really don't remember much from your 8th grade grammar class, which means 99.9% of the population. Now, if you are a teacher trainer, as I am, and you've actually taught a grammar class before, you know what I'm talking about in this next sentence, and that is, you walk into a class of undergraduates or graduate students, and there are people who can't differentiate an adjective from an adverb, can't identify the verb in a sentence. In a sentence such as playing tennis is fun, will try to tell you that playing is a verb because it has an ing, which you know is not right? But they have no idea. My point is, Chapter 2 is a review of the nuts and bolts of English grammar, including the 8 parts of speech, but there's a definite ESL bent every single time. So for example, when we talk about adjectives, we talk about adjectives going, in addition to what an adjective looks like and how to find it, we talk about the fact that adjectives occur before a noun, or they occur after the verb to be. So we talk about where an adjective would be in the English language, as opposed to how it might be placed in Spanish or Japanese or Chinese, okay? So that's chapter 2. My favorite chapter, and the one that your students will appreciate the most, I think, is going to be chapter 3. Chapter 3 is 16 keys for teaching English. And these 16 keys are, in my opinion, the 16 basic nuts and bolts of ESL grammar that you have to have. For example, there will be a key on count and non-count nouns. There's a key on infinitives and gerunds, which is the I want to go, I need to go, but the modals will come up as I can go. Or why is it I enjoy to go, or I enjoy go? Why is it I enjoy going? Well, that's because you have to have a gerund, an ing form after the verb enjoy. All these kind of things that a native speaker gets right, a 5-year-old gets right, but again, you as a 50-year-old or a 25-year-old have no clue how to explain this to somebody. You can't explain what you don't know. Basic teaching 101, right? All right, chapter 4, again, is a really cool chapter, and that's the hot seat questions. What's a hot seat question? If you've taught for more than one day, you know that you've explained your lesson, you prepped your lesson as well as you possibly could, explained everything, and then when you got to the end of the lesson, you as a good teacher naively asked the question, any questions, class? And you're a good teacher, so you wait for the hand to go up, and then lo and behold, the hand goes up, and the student asks you a question, but it's not about what you've just taught. I mean, it's about the language on the board, but it's not the objective of your lesson. And so the student will ask you a question about something about in and on in the sentence when you didn't teach in and on. Why do you say in here? Why not on? And I remember when I started teaching, wow, it was one after the other in class, it seemed like. I was nervous because I was a brand new teacher, as all of your teacher trainees will be. But in addition, I had prepped what? I prepped my lesson on was and were. That's all I knew for that day. And suddenly a question occurs about in and on. And I was underprepared, also known as zero prepared, to teach these kind of hot seat questions. Now, how did I handle that way back in the 70s? I used to go to work early every day, half hour early, sit in a teacher's room, and then ask people, what's up with if? Why is there a chapter called if? If I had a book, if I knew the answer right now, I would tell you. Why if I knew the answer? Knew is past tense, but I'm sitting here right now. Why isn't it if I know the answer? How does that happen? Well, as it turns out, there's a rule about if, and these other teachers were just a wealth of information. They were this book in 1978, and that's what saved me. So the hot seat questions are there. And now we're going to Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is the teaching techniques, which you'll find 25 teaching techniques there. And it ranges from the most mundane thing as get off the chair, go to the whiteboard, and please use the whiteboard because adult learners appreciate having visuals, to something as how to do a drill, or how to write certain kind of exercises like multiple choice activities and things like that. There are 25 techniques. Now I will share this with you. The single best comment or suggestion I've gotten from teachers, from professors like me who are using this in the field is, what many people do is when they teach this book in the course, they combine chapters 4 and 5. And what they have their students do is, they have the students choose one of the teaching techniques from Chapter 5, and there are 25 of those. And then they have the students choose one of the hot seat questions, and there are 20 of those right now in that chapter. So for example, I might be assigned hot seat question 17 and teaching technique number 13, and my job is to whenever we do class presentations is, I have to do a presentation for 10 minutes in which I teach that hot seat question using the technique found in Chapter 5. Now, I will tell you, there's a lot of material here, and if you have to pick and choose, as every good professor does have to pick and choose, I would spend the bulk of my time on Chapter 3, which is those 16 keys for teaching English grammar to English language learners. Chapter 3 is the part of this book you have to have, all right? So if you try to do Chapter 4 and 5 separately, piece by piece, it will take, I think, too long. So the suggestion that I just mentioned is a very good one, I think, for having students cover all of 4 and all of 5. And by the way, if you decide to let your students actually choose one of the techniques from 5 and one of the hot seat questions from 4, it means they will have read all of Chapter 4 and read all of Chapter 5, because every good student is trying to find the easiest hot seat question and the easiest technique. So they'll go through and read it more times than you would ever get if you had assigned it. Now I want to talk a little bit about what's different in this second edition. So we did the first edition a few years back, and it was very well received, and I had a lot of comments from different professors. But also, I teach from this book. I teach this in 2 different courses. I have a graduate course at my university, which is nothing but this book. I mean, we teach pure grammar for people who are actually going to teach ESL. We don't do theoretical grammar because my students are not getting theoretical jobs. They're getting real jobs and need practical knowledge. And that's what this book does that many other grammar books don't do, all right? So I want you to think about that for a second when you're choosing your textbook. It's about choosing something practical here. So as I was teaching from this book over the past 5 or 6 years, I kept detailed notes on things where, gee, maybe it'd be good if we had this, or what if we had that? And so taking all of those notes plus suggestions I got from many other teachers and professors along the way, we produced this new second edition. This second edition is not a kind of superficial light change. It's a very, very detailed change that took a full year of implementation, in the planning and implementation when we were writing this new edition. But many different things are here. For example, those gray boxes, you have a lot more gray boxes in there, all right? Another thing that's different is the keys. If you have a first edition, there are only 15 keys. And one thing that people mention, and I noticed this as well, is we didn't do as thorough a job covering the do, does, did auxiliary verb, which is something that's unique to English as a second language, right? So when you negate in Spanish, you just say, I know like, or I know have, but in English you have to use this don't, or doesn't, or didn't. Where did that do, does, did come from? Well, we cover that in key 16, all right? Another one of the things that's different in this book, in this new edition, that's really important is when I used to teach this book, we're teaching from this teacher book, and it made sense to my future teachers, but there was always a gap in my mind between, well, gee, when you actually go to teach this count and non-count nouns, the oatmeal cookie exercise, for lack of a better example here, when you actually teach that in Japan, your conversation class, what will it really look like in a textbook? And a lot of the teachers in my class or teacher trainees have not taught before, probably about a 40-60 split, with 60% never having taught ESL in their life and never having even seen an ESL book. So I used to have them go through a separate student, an actual ESL workbook. We used, I think, one of my Clear Grammar books, Clear Grammar 1 or Clear Grammar 2, and if you were doing the count and non-count unit from here, then 3 people might present tonight an exercise from that unit. The problem was that we were having to go outside and grab a lot of things. So one of the new things in this book that's really important is there's an appendix in the back of the book, and in that appendix what you'll find is for the 16 keys which are in Chapter 3, for each of those 16 keys you're going to find 16 exercises, real exercises. These weren't written for this book, these were taken from existing ESL grammar books to match the key. And what you're going to find is on the left-hand side of the page you'll find the actual sort of snapshot of that exercise page from the student workbook or student book. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to find teacher notes. And these notes don't exist in that book. These are notes that I've written telling you, this future teacher, gee, this exercise does a certain kind of thing. This is why you would want to do this exercise. And at this point, you might want to stop and ask your students a certain thing because it's going to trick them up a little bit, which is what you want them to do because you want them to stop and have to think about what's happening on that page. One of the cool things, if you're a professor teaching from this book, is those 16 exercises. Let's be honest, I could have chosen just 16 simple fill-in-the-blank activities. I didn't do that. I went through and for each of those 16 activities, I chose 16 different activities. So you'll find something that's even from the most mundane, such as you have to just fill in the blank. So for example, the verb to be, it might have I blank, you blank, he blank, she blank, etc. And it says fill in the verb, fill in the blanks, and the student just writes am, is, are. It's what the ESL student would do on day 1. You could also have multiple choice. There's a whole page of multiple choice explaining why multiple choice activities are not the villain that you might have heard in some of your assessment classes. We're not trying to promote multiple choice, but if you've never actually tried to do a multiple choice activity as the teacher, somebody needs to lead this future teacher through doing one of those activities. So there's an A, B, C, D activity. What do? You just stand there and read out the letters? No, how do you actually go through and get people to think about the other choices that are there? And then we also have, to give you the whole gamut, there are speaking activities. So one of my favorites is where you'll have a page that has 25 houses on it, small little drawings. Some houses have a black roof, some have a gray roof, some have a door on the left, the right, etc. And it's just asking a series of yes/no questions. Is the roof black? Yes or no? Is the door on the left? Yes or no? It just practices the verb to be again, but in a spoken format, if you will, there. All right. I'd also add that for those who need extra help, we do have a workbook here. And so the workbook that goes with this textbook, the workbook matches the book verbatim. So what you're going to find is, you're going to find that if you're on page 100 here, and you have something where it says, for example, in the textbook it might say 100, but it says Chapter 3, A.2. It matches it up that way. Here in the workbook, when you turn to the pages, you'll also see that it says Chapter 3, A.2. All right? So I did want to talk also about, if you've heard me speak recently about vocabulary and grammar, and if you've been to any kind of conference where you've heard me, my big area of research, of course, is grammar. You know grammar, but it's vocabulary, vocabulary, and vocabulary. And in fact, many of you might know me from my Michigan book, Vocabulary Myths from 2004, okay, where we talk about some of the most basic research principles of teaching vocabulary, and that you may have heard in your native speaking classes about how vocabulary is not something you have to teach, you just sort of pick it up, sort of the osmosis approach. If you sit there long enough, you'll learn it. Well, we know that doesn't work, all right, because they are sitting in my class and they're not learning very much here. So explicit teaching of vocabulary, what do? Now, you might think that vocabulary and grammar are two separate items, and that's clearly one way to do it. So yeah, I'm sitting in a chair right now, and chair is not tied to any specific grammar point, except why do you say a chair? Why do you have to have a or a in front of chair every single time? The word chair by itself never, as a noun, doesn't exist in the English word without something in front of it. A chair, my chair, this chair, that chair, etc. And that's because chair is a singular count noun. So what if I could tell you something about vocabulary connected to these grammar points? And actually we can. So for each of those 16 grammar points that are in Chapter 3, which are again, if I had to pick, if you're only going to cover one chapter from this book, and that's the main reason you're going to use this book, it's going to be Chapter 3 by far. So I'll keep harping on count and non-count nouns today. Let's use that example again. So we know that when you want to ask about the number or amount of some noun, you have two options in English, how many or how much. As it turns out, teacher to teacher, I'll tell you, of course, that with count nouns like chair, you're going to use how many chairs. And with other nouns that you can't count, like money, you're going to say how much money. Although your students will say how many money, and they'll say how much chair, right? Which is why we're teaching this in the first place. But when we look at the vocabulary research connected to this grammar point, let's take how many. So we have the whole English language with actually thousands and thousands and thousands of words. And after how many and how much, you could, in theory, use any noun in the English language. So I could say how much air is in this room, and I could say how much carpeting is on this floor, and I could say how many books do you see behind me. And I clearly would be correct in using how many and how much in those cases. But what if we can actually go into a corpus, which is just nothing but a body of actual language? Not language that I speak or that you speak, but language that actual people use outside in the real world. And so we get a corpus, something like the COCA, which is the Corpus of Contemporary American English, one of the more famous corpora out there. So if we go into COCA, which is 560 million words, and we put in the term how many, we'll look and see what nouns actually occur after how many. And it turns out there are, of course there's a long list that will occur, but there are 8 nouns that tend to co-occur, or collocate is the word. They co-occur with how many much, much more than the other gazillions of words that are there. Now if I ask a teacher, and I'll tell you this if you're a teacher trainer as I am, when you ask your students in your own class, well gee, what nouns do you think occur after how many? The teachers always say things like how many students, how many classes, how many books, how many pencils. And as it turns out, in the real world, people don't talk about students, classes, pencils, and books the way we do because we're biased because of what we do all day. In the real world, what do you think the top 8 nouns are for how many? Well, what I could tell you is to go ahead and get a copy of Keys, and if you look for Key 6, you'll find the answer to that. But I know you're curious right now, well, I'll tell you some of them. It turns out that there are 4 that deal with people and 4 that deal with time, and I'll tell you what 4 of those are right now. The 4 people words are how many people, how many women, how many kids, and how many children. That's not the exact order, if you will. And the time words, again, those are listed for you in the book there. But the bottom line is that this important connection between grammar and vocabulary is something that's been researched mostly within the last, 10 years in our field. It's a very, very big and growing field, the field of corpus linguistics. And in this book, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only teacher training book that includes that material there for you, okay? So what I'm trying to do is, my future teachers, I'll leave you with this one point. One of the biggest problems that I find that future teachers have is when they try to explain something, even if they know the rule about count and non-count, you're going to have to give examples. And when they start giving examples, they tend to use examples that are right in front of them right there. And that's not a bad thing because, for example, if I have a book right here, it makes sense. It's something I can hold up. It's the here and now. And I can say how many books do I have in my hand, how many books are on Susan's desk, etc. But if you're trying to train your students to have better listening and speaking and reading and writing skills in the real world, then you don't want to arm them with just how many goes with count nouns, all the count nouns in the whole world. That's theoretical grammar, okay, minus all the labeling. But we're not trying to train teachers, our future teachers, to be linguists. We're trying to train them to be future teachers. And they need to have a really good idea of what some of those most common noun, grammar plus word, in this case how many plus noun combinations are. And I find that future teachers are notoriously bad, to be honest, about coming up with examples that are relevant to their students, but at the same time realistic in terms of actual production and usage in the English language. So there you have it. This is the book, Keys to Teaching Grammar to English Language Learners, the 2nd edition, the 5 chapters. And I guess if I could leave you with 2 things, it would be Chapter 3, those 16 hot seat questions, and then Chapter 4, which is the hot seat questions there, and will help you down the road and when your students are suddenly at the whiteboard and find themselves like the deer in the headlights, lost for what to do. All right? Thank you very much.